Hey, I told you guys I'll be back. So, this, I'm pretty sure everyone knows, this is part 2. If you somehow haven't watched part 1, there will be a description, there will be a link in the description box below. And also the link of the playlist as well. But this is part 2, so no more dilly-dally, no need for an intro or nothing. This is essentially a continue off from the last video, which was not the last video, but the last part. So we're just gonna go with part 2 of the Mrs. Puff theory. Sinister.
So, there's been a lot of new evidence that's come out about Mrs. Puff since I posted my theory. Some I already added to the main theory, like her real name being discovered, so go watch that if you haven't
Bobby
already.
Blowfish.
But I saved some really cool discoveries and new ideas just for this mini theory.
Alright.
Like, in Lighthouse Louie, I missed this the first time, but if you look closely in her pile of junk, you can actually see a dead police officer's corpse. Oh my god! Actually, no, this is just an obstacle from her training course.
Oh.
But I bet you didn't know, in Camp Coral, we see her dispose of the real Mrs. Puff's dead body!
No!
Also, no, this is just a piñata that looks like her. Okay, but they're clearly trying to mess with us at this point. Before I get into the actual new discoveries, I want to talk about some alternative ideas I've come up with for some parts of the Mrs. Puff theory.
Okay.
As I've already said, I am not the biggest fan of where I took the third part of this theory. I really wanted there to be this big reveal about why the prison is forcing Mrs. Puff to teach SpongeBob, when, in reality, it just makes so much more sense that, like in Doing Time, every time Mrs. Puff sees SpongeBob in jail, she's actually just hallucinating.
Good day, class! I must be having a nightmare!
You know, there's just way more direct evidence in the show.
Honestly, yeah, at that point, it just makes more sense as just... Maybe there is an actual, like, driving instructor, but because Mrs. Puff was so delusional that she's seeing SpongeBob. Because, like, there's no way they're going to have SpongeBob be a driving teacher in the prison cells for the summer when my man's has basically destroyed a town more ways than once whenever he steps foot in a boatmobile. So, like, I just think it might be Mrs. Puff just having one of her crazy stuff.
Support this, as opposed to this convoluted warden theory. And it's further supported by my new imagination mini theory from earlier in this video. We know the show
You can check it out in the playlist.
Things you imagine can easily come to life. And Mrs. Puff is constantly imagining her fear of SpongeBob or the guilt from her past mistakes. So it makes sense that she would get trapped in her own delusions so often.
Yeah.
But there's always been this big loose end in my theory that I've always wanted to find a way to wrap up. We know Mrs. Puff prematurely gave a license to one of her previous students in Kelp City, and that led to the city being destroyed.
Local consensus places the blame on this negligent, selfish driving instructor.
But who was Mrs. Puff's original student before SpongeBob?
Oh yeah, that's true.
While we haven't gotten any new evidence about this, I think I've got 2 strong candidates for who it could be. One of the best comments I got from the Mrs. Puff video was the idea that the original student was actually SpongeBob's cousin, Stanley S. Squarepants.
Stanley? Bro, I haven't seen this man since that one episode. But no, it can't be Stanley. It can't be Stanley, because certainly Mrs. Puff should have at least made a passing comment like, you know, how Stanley and SpongeBob are the same. But there's no way, right? We never really see Mrs. Puff interact with Stanley. Heck, Stanley only showed up for one episode, unless the new seasons are directing that.
Hi, Squidward! I'd like you to meet my cousin Stanley. We're related.
There's 2 of them! Stanley is a character we meet for only one episode in Season 5. He's SpongeBob's cousin from out of town, and he's extremely accident-prone, even more than SpongeBob.
Dang.
Now, we don't don't know what town he's from, but we know his Uncle Sherm sent him away because he was too destructive. So he totally fits the idea of Mrs. Puff's former student that probably destroyed New Kelp City. It would also add another layer to why Mrs. Puff is so tortured by SpongeBob specifically. He would literally look and act exactly like her former student.
There's two out
Like
there.
So
Stanley.
yeah, I think this is totally plausible. Great comment. The only thing that kind of holds this theory back is the lack of any actual concrete connection between Stanley and Mrs. Puff. Like, unfortunately, they're never in the same episode. But I think I have another possible candidate for this mystery student. Someone who we actually see interact with Mrs. Puff. In the
Who?
Mrs. Puff theory, I theorize that the entire episode Doing Time was all imagined by Mrs. Puff.
Uh-huh.
And everything we see, even small details like her changing prison uniforms, are symbolic for what's really going on inside of her head.
Yeah.
If that's true, then what does this random other prisoner that keeps showing up symbolize?
Hey there, Puff Mama. What's today's grub?
Hi, Donna. It's Chili. I wouldn't have thought much about it if it wasn't for this very
Donna?
interesting moment where she returns at the end of the episode.
Oh, it's just my imagination again.
So what's for dinner tonight, Puff Mama? Chili?
I think this could be
Dang.
implying that Donna is Mrs. Puff's original student. We see her driving Mrs. Puff's boat in a free-fall crash, just like her old student probably also did.
Yeah.
And then she literally gets replaced by SpongeBob.
So what's for dinner tonight, Puff Mama? Chili?
Ah, forget it.
Just like how we actually replaced
SpongeBob
her.
with that goofy smile too, as he's basically not phased that we're just falling. But yeah, I just feel like, I feel like it is Donna.
Original student. So yeah, I think both Donna and Stanley are pretty good candidates for the original student. Stanley is a bit more thematically fitting, but Donna actually has some direct evidence in the
Yeah.
show. So yeah, I could see.
I feel like
either
Donna
of them,
just fits
but
more.
that's
I'm
all
sorry,
just
Stanley.
tying up loose ends. The real reason I decided to cover Mrs. Puff again in this mini theory is because of two major new developments in recent SpongeBob episodes.
Two?
The first is in the season 13 episode, Arbor Day Disarray. In this episode, Sandy gives everyone trees she grew, and we get this scene between Mrs. Puff and her tree.
I love talking to someone who knows how to keep a secret. I can finally tell someone what really happened when I pulled that job in Shell City.
What? When I pulled that job in Shell City. You mean the same Shell City that... Shell City? God dang, I can't speak for deafin. You mean the same place that your husband is now in?
What really happened when I pulled that job in Shell City? They're still adding more mysteries to solve about Mrs. Puff. It sounds like Mrs. Puff did some kind of heist or maybe has some connection to Shell City from the SpongeBob movie. And if you remember, I theorized that Shell City was the place Mr. Puff, her former dead husband, was being held. They end up setting off the smoke detector, which activates the sprinkler system and brings all the dead fish back to life, including a very familiar-looking pufferfish hanging from the ceiling. Mr. Puff is alive.
Oh, he
So,
was using-
is it possible
he was
this
using,
job
old
is
clips.
somehow related to Mr. Puff? Well, before we get into that, there is one more new development we need to talk about.
Really?
In the season 14 episode, Hysterical History, for the very first time ever, we actually do get to definitively see Mr. Puff when he was alive.
Really?
Bikini Bottom's own titan of industry, Mr. Puff, ran the first successful boat assembly line.
So, this episode is just a bunch of flashbacks from Bikini Bottom's history, and we learn that Mr. Puff was actually a wealthy businessman businessman who ran a boat factory. And Sandy later confirms that this is all actually true. This isn't just a story SpongeBob made up. Now, Mr. Puff looks and sounds a lot like Mrs. Puff.
Speed up, line number 5.
And the other flashbacks in this episode seem to be about ancestors of our main characters. So
Yeah, it
maybe
has,
this is actually supposed to be just a
SpongeBob,
relative
I think.
of Mrs. Puff, not
Or
her
primitive
dead husband.
SpongeBob.
But remember, Mrs. Puff is not originally from Bikini Bottom, and we know her last name isn't really Puff. It's Blowfish. So this is most likely her former husband, Mr. Puff,
Blowfish.
before he died. And unfortunately, this does seem to disprove my Mr. Puff theory, because he clearly looks very different than the pufferfish we see in Shell City.
Eh.
Even if this pufferfish wasn't Mr. Puff, I don't think I was wrong about Mr. Puff being at Shell City. The fact that he's shown as a dried up, hanging pufferfish with googly eyes is way too similar to be a coincidence. And then there's the fact that they just confirmed Mrs. Puff has some sort of history with Shell City specifically. I think Mr. Puff was abducted and taken to Shell City, but the reason why we don't see him in the SpongeBob movie is probably because he was already sold to some.
Dang, already sold? Nah, that's messed up. We never seen this hand or background in Shell City. He's probably at home of whoever bought him. Dang.
Someone else by that point, meaning he was unfortunately never saved by SpongeBob. So that leaves us with one final question. What was the job Mrs. Puff pulled at Shell City, and what does it have to do with her husband's death? Well, my first guess is that...
Don't tell me she killed her husband. If she killed her husband, I'm going to be very sick to my stomach.
this job was some sort of
'Cause
rescue
SpongeBob,
mission to save
Mrs.
Puff
Puff
from
is a
Shell City,
murderer.
and she failed. But listen to how she talks about it.
I can finally tell someone what really happened when I pulled that job in Shell City.
Whatever happened at Shell City, she's happy about it. In fact, it's kind of a...
Look at that grin. Look at that smirk. Look at it. She's almost doing like that, almost wink, wink, nod, nudge type of glance.
sinister, nefarious happiness.
What really happened?
Look at that. Tell
She's
me I'm
not
wrong.
devastated that her husband was lost forever. She's happy about it. I never really considered this before, but could Mrs. Puff actually be responsible for her husband's death? Did Mrs. Puff kill her husband?
Oh.
I mean, we know Plankton sold Neptune's crown to Shell City.
I just wanted to say thanks again for selling me the crown. I sold it to a guy in Shell City.
So it does seem possible to arrange for this kind of thing to happen. And Arbor Day Disarray ends with Mrs. Puff's tree ratting her out to the police.
Hello, police department? I got a lead on that Shell City job. I gotta go.
Why would the Bikini Bottom
She was
police
freaking out
care
too.
about something she did at a human gift
Get
shop?
her.
I mean, they didn't care
Now.
what SpongeBob stole from there. The only explanation is that she wasn't stealing from humans. She was giving them something or someone from Bikini Bottom, Mr. Puff. Mrs. Puff arranged for fishermen to kidnap and kill her husband. That's what really happened at Shell
No.
City. But why? Well, other than...
Why is the reason? Yes, why? Why would she do it? Come on now, Mrs. Puff. Look, okay. Just continue the video. I want to see
Mr.
why
Puff
she did it.
kind of seeming like a jerk who mistreats his employees. He's also very wealthy, which means that when he died, in a way that can't be traced back to Mrs. Puff, as his wife, she would inherit his money.
She
which
belongs to the
explains
streets.
how Mrs. Puff, who previously had to abandon her entire life and start over from scratch in Bikini Bottom, could afford to open a massive boating school. Maybe this was her plan all along. Get close to some rich jerk, marry him, and then have him killed to inherit his money.
Wait a
These
minute.
little breadcrumbs they've given us have told us so much more about Mrs. Puff's past. But also, maybe, just maybe, her future as well.
What do you
Mr.
mean?
Puff was portrayed as a greedy, unethical capitalist who only
Yeah.
cared about money, even at the expense of his employees.
Uh-huh.
And Does that remind you of anyone
No!
else in Mrs. Puff's life?
No! No, not my boy Eugene!
Here the arm comes off. Keep on trucking, SpongeBob.
How could you trade SpongeBob for 60
Eugene,
toes?
no!
I could have gotten more.
If she did it to Mr. Puff, who's to say she's not planning to do it again to Mr. Krabs? Maybe this is the entire reason why she's dating him. Let's just hope Mr. Krabs isn't planning on getting married anytime soon. The imaginary doppelganger Mr. Krabs, that is. And that is the Mrs. Puff theory, part 2.
No. Oh, that's... Oh, no. Yeah, you know what? Whatever I said to Sandy, I am taking it all back. I am taking it all back. Mrs. Puff, you belong to the streets. She belongs to the streets. To the streets she emerged, and the streets shall she returns. Someone needs to call out Mrs. Puff right now. Listen, Mr. Squidward. Squidward, listen. I know you have your beef with SpongeBob. I mean, your beef with Mr. Krabs. He clearly treats SpongeBob in a higher caliber of you. And, you know, he makes you work But listen, I got a band of $200 if you blow the whistle and save Eugene. Matter of fact, or heck, maybe help the fake Eugene. I don't care which Eugene it is. All I know is that their access to the money. Oh no. Oh no. SpongeBob, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to call her out. Because she's now... So your driving teacher is now like also someone who instructs the deafs of her husbands and take all the money. What type of mystery house is this? This feels like murder mystery. This feels like a murder mystery type plot. No, that's... So we got Mr. Krabs, who's not even the real Mr. Krabs. We got Sandy, who is a spy. And Mrs. Puff, she is complete. We need to put the straight jacket, is all I had to say for her. This is... I don't know what to say. I can't. I can't right now. This is... I can't right now. Ah, yes, the evolution theory. Now, I wonder if... Okay, we did do a reaction on the evolution theory, so... I'm hoping that whatever I'm hoping that the stuff that we learned from the evolution theory gets expanded upon in this new one, as well as also the bonus theory. But yeah, we're basically at the end now. After this, we're going to be watching the original theory, and then we can continue off with the new ones. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you leave a like on both part 1 and part 2 of the videos. I as much as I would love to have it to be 1 hour, the video was... My device was burning, to say the least. My device was burning. So as much as I would love to give you a 1 hour video, it just couldn't be done. But hopefully this makes up, and hopefully I release both parts in the same day. Maybe on the same time. Who knows on how I do it. But yeah. Make sure you comment down below what do you guys think. Because honestly, Mrs. Puff, you need to get out of here. Someone needs to lock her up. Lock her up for good. Matter of fact, the warden, I thought you was really a bottom feeder, but honestly, you're probably saving Mr. Krabs at this point. It's crazy, man. It's crazy. But yeah. This is Juan Gamer 54 signing off.